Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I am here to talk about some of the books that I've read recently, and I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like this past summer was a sort of weird fever dream, and I can't even keep track of everything that happened. It was really busy. I was kind of all over the place. Even in the last couple of weeks, I've been like down to Big Sur and up to Crater Lake, which has all been great, but I'm really glad that it's September and things are winding down and I can kind of get back into all of my routines and just sort of chill out a little bit. So let's get into the books, many of which I enjoyed, but also don't really remember now. So it's kind of in that sort of reading stretch. So let's get into it. First up, I have Margaret the First by Danielle Dutton, which I believe I first saw on Jennifer from Insert Literary Puns channel, RIP to Jen's channel. It tells the story of Margaret Cavendish, who was an English duchess in the 17th century and who published works of fiction and poetry and science and philosophy, which was quite unusual for women at that time. And she was quite a noteworthy person of her era, a sort of tabloid celebrity, if you will, known for her writings, which were both respected and ridiculed, and for things like the black stars that she wore on her face to cover up blemishes, and the kind of provocative and outlandish outfits that she would wear. At one point, she showed up at a social gathering dressed as an Amazon with her breasts completely bared and her nipples painted red, just as one example. And this novel is really Danielle Dutton's attempts to capture the inner workings of Margaret's mind, which was often abuzz with color and thoughts and theories about how the world turns. And Dutton's writing and use of language here really reflects the richness and inventive quality of Margaret's mind. Her descriptions right from the jump are lush and evocative and so imaginative. And so in terms of sentence by sentence mastery of language, this book almost reminded me a little bit of The Great Gatsby, in that every description and image and word feels like a purposeful and carefully selected gemstone, and the whole book glitters because of that. And beyond that, Dutton is really able to capture the frenzy and the striving of the individual mind, and Margaret's attempts, both scientific and completely fanciful, to sort of fathom the universe. And this book captures an interesting moment in human history when scientific theory is still emerging, but hasn't quite laid down all of its foundational principles yet. And so it's this period rich in conjecture and imagination. Dutton also shifts perspective in different sections of the book, moving from first person to third person in order to examine both Margaret's intense internal life and also her external public persona and the tensions that often exist between the two. At one point she says, "Bold on the page, in life I was only Margaret." And later there's this reflection that is almost Walt Whitman-esque in its attempt to kind of express the multitudes that can be contained in one person. It says, "Margaret wanted the whole house to move 3 feet to the left. It was indescribable what she wanted. She was restless. She wanted to work. She wanted to be 30 people. She wanted to wear a cap of pearls and a coat of bright blue diamonds, to live as nature does, in many ages, in many brains." And so in addition to the beautiful language in this book, that exploration of a mind that is constantly churning and always curious but never quite satisfied was something that I found really interesting. And I think this book is graceful and precise and absolutely sticks the landing on everything it's trying to accomplish. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a story that has lingered with me in the weeks since I finished it. I kind of think of it as this sort of beautiful but somewhat superfluous ornament that you might put on a shelf. There's nothing super urgent or necessary about it. So it was a beautiful book, but not necessarily something that I'm like rushing out to tell everyone they need to read. Then I have All You Can Ever Know by Nicole Chung, which is a memoir about her experiences growing up as a Korean American adoptee raised by white parents in a predominantly white town in Southern Oregon, and her subsequent constant search for her birth family. And I've been aware of this book for a while because I follow Nicole Chung on Twitter. She is a former editor of The Toast, the late great Toast, and I've seen this book on a lot of fall reading lists. It comes out October 2nd, so I requested it from Catapult, and I really liked this book. I think there's a lot to admire here. It's a very readable story about adoption and transracial adoption specifically, and what it's like to grow up without any biological ties to anyone, and what it's like to love your parents but to also feel a certain sense of loss or lack because you don't really know where you came from. And a lot of people have been saying that you should read this book if you loved Little Fires Everywhere, not only because Celeste Ng has a big blurb on the front of the book, but also because both books deal with the topic of transracial adoption. And as someone who didn't really like Little Fires Everywhere and thought that that book glossed over that topic, if that's something that you're interested in, I definitely recommend reading this book because it looks at transracial adoption in a much deeper and more nuanced way. But beyond that, I thought that Nicole's actual search for her birth family and what ultimately came of that was the most interesting and surprising and moving and compelling part of this book. And what I appreciate in her recounting of this period in her life is her ability to acknowledge that two seemingly contradictory things can be true at the same time. So she acknowledges that she experienced a lot of pain and confusion by being raised without any ties to her birth parents. But she also realizes later on that she escaped a lot of pain by not growing up with her birth parents. Similarly, the experience of being adopted has left her with a feeling of displacement and rootlessness, while also being the best thing that ever happened to her in many ways. And I just liked how she acknowledged those conflicting feelings and how there are no real absolutes in anything, and how adoption is a complicated thing that is often many things at once. All that being said, I think this book is interesting to the extent that the events of Nicole Chung's life are interesting. There's nothing really in the writing or storytelling that elevates it beyond that, and it really kind of feels like an extended version of a first-person essay that you might read online. And Nicole Chung is indeed someone who writes first-person essays on the internet for different outlets, and the writing in this book is good, but it's also fairly standard, and I don't know if that's the way that Nicole Chung has always written, or if it's a product of her having written for many different outlets over the course of many years, and if her writing has been kind of honed down to this sort of uniform style that fits with a lot of different publications. And I don't think that's unique to Nicole Chung. I think a lot of internet essayists write that way nowadays, and I just wish that the writing in this book had a little bit more of her individual voice in it. Next up, I read Severance by Ling Ma, which I read via NetGalley, and this is a post-apocalyptic story in which the world's population has succumbed to Shen fever, which infects victims and causes them to repeat rote everyday tasks over and over again, basically until their brains turn to mush and they die. And in this novel, we follow a young 20-something woman named Candace, who is one of the few people who seems to be immune to the virus, and we follow her as she attempts to escape New York City with some other survivors. And the story is interspersed with flashbacks from Candace's life in New York City in the weeks leading up to and just after the fever's outbreak, when she was working in an office that produced commercial Bibles. And it's a great premise and a kind of subversive take on the apocalyptic genre that suggests that our great undoing won't come from some catastrophic outside threat, but will rather come from our own sort of drone-ish subservience to work and routine and the capitalist machine. And the fact that the fever kind of mimics and exaggerates everyone's soulless worker bee tendencies means that it's difficult at first to identify who has been infected, and that's just one of the many dark and clever details that Ling Ma folds into her story building and world building in this book. And she sets it up so well that I actually enjoyed the flashbacks to the fever's outbreak much more than I enjoyed the later survivalist passages about Candace's escape from the city. And so I ended up really liking about half of this book. And for the flashbacks, I really enjoyed the way that she explored the anxieties of the modern era and the exploitation that we all participate in a capitalist society, and how we use aspects of capitalism to create meaning in our lives. And there are some really interesting individual scenes within the flashbacks, including a work trip that Candace takes to a factory in China, which is the country that her parents were born in, and it's there that she has to kind of navigate a sort of complicated cultural connection and a cultural severance. And even the level of detail with which Ling Ma describes the logistics of Bible production is just totally delightful. So I really thought the individual parts of this book were really great at times, and I wish they had just come together into a sort of greater whole. Lastly, I have My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, which I really enjoyed and am still thinking about, so I definitely recommend it, and I recommend that you go check out my full review of that if you want to hear my complete thoughts. I'm going to link it up here and down below. So those are all the books that I've been reading lately. I'm hoping to get back in the swing of things now that summer is over. Let me know what you've been reading lately, what you've been doing this summer, what you're looking forward to this fall. Whatever's going on, let me know. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!